You're listening to podcasts from the Congressional Internet Caucus Advisory Committee, www.netcaucus.org.
Good morning, or afternoon as the case may be. I wanted to, thank you. I wanted to, that's much better, just briefly give an overview of sort of the framework for spectrum management and where unlicensed use fits within the framework, because I think when you talk about the benefits of something, to the extent they're relevant, it's nice to have a little background. So I'm going to try and do this quickly. Easiest analogy I've ever been able to come up with for spectrum management is it's similar to zoning of real property. So why is there zoning? You know, there are a lot of old legal cases where somebody would try to put a meat processing plant immediately adjacent to a residential neighborhood, and that made people in the residential neighborhood uncomfortable. Zoning developed to try to provide some framework around when a landowner might be able to put in an industrial use or not, or what type of residential use, and hopefully you're all familiar with zoning, otherwise the analogy doesn't work. With spectrum, there are some similar concerns. Some types of systems, broadcast systems, operate at a very high level of power, and think of power as somewhat analogous to distance here, and therefore it'll affect a lot of things, and affect a lot of things that are lower power. So in general, in spectrum, you try to keep high power uses away from low power uses. In the same way with land, you might want to keep building a industrial factory type facility or a power plant away from a residential neighborhood. All right, so in the spectrum world, that's called allocation. So they allocate, I think of it as zoning. You can use this spectrum for broadcasting, and that tells the world, hey, there's probably going to be a high power use there. My low power use that I'm thinking about may not work next to it. Then the second thing is just like you get a zoning permit, here's part two of the analogy, you can get a permit to build a particular type of plant. Right? So you've got industrial property. Doesn't necessarily mean every possible type of industrial use is available. Oftentimes you have to get a use permit. That's what a spectrum license is analogous to. So something's allocated for broadcasting, but hey, I want to do a particular kind. Well, you get a license. And that usually gives that person an exclusive right to use that spectrum. Why do I go through all this? Well, there's sort of three approaches that have developed around that basic framework when it comes to spectrum. One of them I'm going to call inflexibly licensed spectrum uses, also sometimes called command and control, but I think inflexible is more readily understandable. Second one I'd call flexibly licensed uses, and then the third one is unlicensed. And I usually talk about them in terms of a triangle, which hopefully you can see. I tried to do a visual representation. Because, why a triangle? Because the boundaries between them are not in their entirety completely clear. So, first two, inflexibly licensed and flexibly licensed, you have to have an allocation to get a license. So they rely on this allocation process, which there's actually a table of allocations. Think of it as the zoning book at the local county land use committee, coordinator, official. The third one, unlicensed, the biggest distinction is there is no allocation for unlicensed use. By definition, the way I describe it in my spectrum textbook in class is it falls sort of outside the, ordinary or standard, or maybe just it's been around the longest framework of allocation and licensing, or also known as assignment. Okay, so next. And if I were to characterize the boundaries between them or the differences at a very high level, inflexibly licensed spectrum use, typically the FCC or another government body would require that you use a particular technology standard and comply with what I'm calling power limits, but think of them as technical parameters. Classic use is broadcasting. AM broadcasting and FM broadcasting are both. Does everyone still know what those are? Okay, well, these days. They're both, quote, broadcasting, unquote, as far as the allocation is concerned. If all you had was an allocation, you could do FM broadcasting in the AM band. Well, you can't under inflexibly licensed, which is how those bands were done. It's the traditional way. Because the FCC said, thou shalt only use amplitude modulation, AM, in the AM radio band, and conversely, or accordingly, or what have you, FM in the FM band. Okay, that's inflexibly licensed. Flexibly licensed and unlicensed kind of grew up together, time frame wise, and conceptually started, in a similar time frame in the 80s. Flexibly licensed modifies inflexibly licensed mostly with regard to the tech standard. So, still got to comply with power limits, certain technical parameters. But it's flexible in the sense the FCC stopped mandating a particular technology standard. If, for example, AM and FM were flexibly licensed, you could do FM in the AM band and vice versa. Okay, and what's a good example of flexibly licensed? It kind of came of age with mobile, or what you think of as cellular phone radio service. Unlicensed doesn't have an allocation, so by definition under international law is not entitled to interference protection. So there's no license, which is part of what entitles you to that. Also means there's no technology standard, because there's no license, it's not defined. The only real governing function in the unlicensed spectrum, at least traditionally, was technical limits, power limits. And traditionally that has meant it's a very low power service, and we can talk about that. I'll give a little bit of history in a minute. Okay, so we can put the arrow on there. Using flexibly licensed as an example, what happens if something is flexibly licensed, at least in name, and the FCC later mandates that a use of a particular technology standard? Well, whether you call it flexibly licensed or not, it starts to shift or move more towards the an apex corner of the triangle where you have inflexibly licensed. Part of this example is to show how the boundaries can shift over time. Part of it is to show that no matter what you call something in terminology, when you look at the substance of it, is a flexibly licensed spectrum in name truly flexibly licensed if the FCC says thou shalt use a particular technology? In some respects, maybe still yes, but it starts to look a lot more like inflexibly licensed. And that goes for any of these. You could use multiple examples, and they're real world examples. Okay, so next slide. Nobody has to look at these, but they keep me on track. The FCC /NTIA, which does the federal spectrum / the world, because a lot of this or some of this is governed by international treaty, binding international treaty, tends to use all three. Well, and this is what I meant about relative benefits. Why would you use all three of something with different characteristics? Well, there are trade-offs. And so before we launch into a discussion of unlicensed in particular, I thought it'd be nice to know what the trade-offs are. People could argue about, you could attack every one of these. I'm going with what I would say are defensible, widely held views about the trade-offs here, subject to lots of debate. Inflexibly licensed, the pros. When you mandate a technology standard, it becomes ubiquitous, and it also enhances reliability. There's a reason why it still has a role in the world. The FAA, for example, there's internationally harmonized allocation for air navigation, radio air navigation, and international standard. Wherever your aircraft goes in the world, you can communicate, you can land, you can use the radio navigation system because internationally we've agreed to a technology standard for it. It's widely deployed, it's ubiquitous, reliable. Cons. of the three, it has, the least potential or opportunity for innovation. That's in a relative sense only. Why? Well, if you want to change that, we don't like that technology standard anymore. Now you've got to go secure international agreement, negotiate with everyone in the world. So you run into the second part that has the highest transaction costs. You've got to do a lot more negotiation when things are. You can't just do what you want. It's still widely used for things like public safety and which air traffic controls is an example. Flexibly licensed, you're going to get more innovation than inflexibly because you don't have to go ask the FCC for permission to upgrade from 3G to 4G, for example, with cell phones. You can just do it. Lower transaction costs for similar reasons. There's regulatory transaction costs with having to get a license change and others. All right. Potential downside, lower ubiquity. There was a time in this country where a couple of providers had CDMA systems, if you remember that, and a couple had GSM. In part, Europe mandated a standard. The U.S. didn't. You ended up with different standards. Reduces interoperability, et cetera, so lower ubiquity. And to the extent use of different standards by different companies results in interference, lower reliability. I mean, again, I'm not trying to quantify these things. Don't think of these as necessarily extreme differences. Unlicensed, most innovation. You don't have to ask for permission to do anything as far as your technology standard. If somebody has a new idea, they don't have to go to a standards group and work towards consensus. As long as they meet the power limits, they're free to deploy it. Lowest transaction costs for the same reason. You don't have to negotiate with anyone to do whatever it is you want to do. The cons, and you'll note that these things tend to be inverse or corresponding, are lower ubiquity because there are a lot of different technology standards deployed in the unlicensed bands, and that's still true today. And it has the lowest reliability because, when you have potential conflicting, when you have different technology standards, they have the potential for conflict. And does everyone know what a WISP is, a wireless internet service provider? T-Mobile is a wireless internet service provider, but that term tends to refer to a particular, it tends to be used, at least in the communications jargon, to refer to somebody who provides a fixed broadband service using unlicensed spectrum. People think of that as being a Wi-Fi system. For the end users, it typically is. But there was a system, and I'm not sure how widely deployed now. I'm showing how long it's been. But years ago, when I was at the FCC, that's the Canopy system, which was marketed by Motorola. This starts to show you how long ago this was, since they've been absorbed by Google a long time ago. Operated in the unlicensed spectrum to provide a form of backhaul, if you will, and some potentially arguably other functions for WISPs. And we were getting complaints at the FCC. It interferes with Wi-Fi. Well, the irony, that's why I'm telling you the story, is it was facilitating use of a Wi-Fi system, but the Canopy part of the system operated 100% of the time, and anybody who tried to use a Wi-Fi device in close proximity to that might have issues. So that's what I mean by lowest reliability. For the most part, unlicensed bands work. But if you need something with extraordinarily high reliability, it's the lowest out of the three. Okay, that was the 100,000-foot overview of what we're talking about when we say, we should do more of this or more of that. Well, there are trade-offs involved, and this is my attempt to capture them. I'm going to stop doing any more talking, and I told each panelist they could spend a couple minutes just giving their views on unlicensed and the like, and I decided to skip the history because I've already gone on too long. So I'll turn it over to Paul.
Sure. Thanks, Brad. Thank you. So I'm Paula Boyd with Microsoft, and for a very long time we've been engaged on spectrum issues. There's a realization that mobility has, over time, at least over the past decade, really become an important part of how consumers live their lives. maybe about 7 to 10 years ago, folks were talking about being able to access content and information wherever you are and whenever you want it. Today, I think, a teenager or preteen growing up just assume that they can get access to whatever they want, whenever they want it. And that's in large part due to wireless communications. Our approach has been to support getting spectrum out there into the marketplace for wireless broadband. However, we've spent most of our time focused on license. Do recognize that the licensed carriers also need connectivity, but at least at the time that we got out there, not a lot of folks were talking about unlicensed, or not a lot of folks were engaged in unlicensed advocacy. And we decided to get out there. Part of, and I would say too, over the course of the past 7 to 10 years, Microsoft has also evolved as a company. When we first started, and maybe you guys have not had this experience, because I see a lot of young faces in the room, but when I had my first PC, it came in a big box with a bunch of disks, and you had to put them in to load up the operating system, etc. Well, today, when you get your PC, it either comes loaded, or you essentially get a key and you download it over the internet. And that really highlights kind of the transition for Microsoft. We have moved from being a company that is kind of a company that sells a literal product where you could go in and literally buy Office or buy Windows in a store, and you got a box and you got a disk, to a company that really lives online and lives in the cloud. When you think of all of our products, there is a cloud component to our products. You get downloads for Windows, you get downloads for Office. You can play your Xbox console, but there's also Xbox Live, where you can play someone across the internet, or you can compete against someone across the internet. So as time has evolved, connectivity has become really important to Microsoft, and making sure that consumers are comfortable accessing our content and accessing our applications and accessing our services is something that really matters to us, and that's part of why we spend time in the Spectrum area. When you also think about unlicensed, Fred's provided a tutorial about unlicensed, but unlicensed is an allocation or a way of making spectrum available that's been with us for a really long time. The Communications Act, everyone sort of knows the Communications Act is the Communications Act of 1934. That's when the FCC was first created. But very soon after that, in 1938, the FCC first allocated unlicensed spectrum. In 1985, the FCC allocated spectrum that is what I refer to as kind of the workhorse of wireless broadband connectivity, and that's the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum. That's where Wi-Fi came of age. And one of the, I would say, at least from our perspective, one of the main things about unlicensed uses, sort of the low barriers to entry means that anyone can come in and sort of create. Anyone can come in and sort of say, hey, I'm going to try this. And at least in the past decade or more, we've had a tremendous benefit by folks being innovative, leveraging unlicensed spectrum. The other piece of unlicensed that I would also just flag for folks is that I think around town you'll hear a few companies advocating or talking about unlicensed, but unlicensed is just way bigger than the companies that talk about it. We're a fraction of the folks out there that are building the devices or leveraging or having applications that leverage Wi-Fi or leverage Bluetooth or involve RFID technology. I mean, there's just so many more companies out there than the ones here in DC that often talk about it. I'll sort of wrap up with a couple of statistics that I think are kind of noteworthy. In a recent study, the prediction is that by 2019, fixed wireless / Wi-Fi would be carrying 66% of all internet traffic in North America. That is just a massive amount of traffic. And it just highlights sort of, when I refer to it as the workhorse of wireless broadband connectivity, it highlights just how dependent consumers are on unlicensed spectrum. The other couple of stats that I will leave you with as well is that when we talk about sort of the value to the economy, to the GDP with respect to unlicensed, it's been estimated at $6.7 billion. However, the economic surplus has been estimated at $222 billion. So not only are folks creating devices, applications, services that leverage Wi-Fi and other unlicensed services, but those technologies, that spectrum is then allowing folks to do other things, and not only selling those products, but leveraging those products either to deliver other experiences or enhance productivity, and so you get a pretty significant economic surplus. With that said, I will leave you with the notion that as you think about spectrum, as you think about spectrum policy, and as you think about sort of our economy and what we do with spectrum and how we leverage spectrum and the high-tech components of that, I think unlicensed spectrum has to be at the forefront of those thoughts and considerations.
Great, thank you. John Hunter, T-Mobile. I was actually going to give a little historical context from our company's perspective. I don't think it's a stretch to say that we've been an industry leader in Wi-Fi unlicensed for, more than a decade. I think if you go back to 2002, where T-Mobile launched T-Mobile Hotspot, we deployed several thousand Wi-Fi access points across the country. Couple that with a couple Wi-Fi service providers for roaming agreements. We essentially had a nationwide network of fixed wireless Wi-Fi spots at major venues for our customers. So that was a high-speed, what we considered at the time, high-speed data for our customers. And why do I say that? I think you have to put in context where the mobile industry was back in 2002. We didn't have 4G, we didn't have 3G. I recall building out the 2G Edge network, which was painfully slow. It was about 100 kilobits per second is what you would get. It was just a little bit better than dial-up. So we learned a lot through this offering for our customers. We innovated along the way. In 2007, we expanded on that platform, offering a product called T-Mobile Hotspot at Home, recognizing the fact that Wi-Fi has proliferated throughout the economy. Most folks now have routers in their home. And so T-Mobile brought to the United States for the first time a product called Unlicensed Mobile Access. And UMA is a product that enables mobile phones to make voice calls, text messages over the Wi-Fi access point, but it gets better. It has a controller that gives seamless interoperability from the Wi-Fi network to the macro cellular network. We were the leaders of that. We brought that to the United States. And we did that for a number of reasons. I think if you look at spectrum as a whole, not all spectrum is created equal, as we all know. Not having a lot of the low-band spectrum, you try to find unique and creative ways to enhance an in-building experience. And the UMA, the T-Mobile Hotspot at Home product, allowed us to do that. And just some stats that I'll just give you. Since we've unveiled that offering in 2007, we have over 35 million Wi-Fi calling-enabled devices in our network today. We do over 11 million Wi-Fi calls on average daily. So it's been a big, successful platform for us. We're continuing to innovate there. Just last year, we unveiled Un-carrier 7.0, which is dubbed Wi-Fi Unleashed. And going forward, T-Mobile will be selling every smartphone in our portfolio will have Wi-Fi enabled calling. And that includes the iPhone. We brought that feature to the iPhone. And we also announced an agreement with, you probably have heard of an airline provider named GoGo. And they offer Wi-Fi access on aircraft. So T-Mobile was the first in providing text messaging while in flight, while on an aircraft. So we have a long history of innovation in this space. We're going to continue to innovate in Wi-Fi. But I will tell you, we're also going to look at other unlicensed technologies like LTE-U that hold a lot of promise and would give our customers greater throughputs that they've come to expect from the Un-carrier. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Laura Clark. I work with the American Library Association in the Office for Information Technology Policy, and I think I would be the new kid on this block. I don't have a decade or two of experience in this space, but the importance of unlicensed spectrum and Wi-Fi has exploded in libraries in the same way that it's exploded for all of these other industries and sectors. What it means for libraries is it means that we can increase our capacity for public internet access, which continues to grow. People can bring their own devices as well as us providing it to them. It means that we can also be more innovative in our spaces with mobile training labs, with roving reference, with collaborative workspaces that allow people to take advantage of the Wi-Fi. And it also is about the user experience, similar to any other industry. For folks that have the data plans, the Wi-Fi obviously allows them to offload. For folks that do not have a data plan, the Wi-Fi is a lifeline, and we see that a lot in our libraries. But this unlicensed use, this Wi-Fi space, is critical to something that I am an expert in, which is around equity of access. It's about lowering barriers to people having access to information and services, and Wi-Fi is more and more important in that, in our work, and so I'm trying hard to catch up with all the experts in this space to better understand how can we preserve and protect unlicensed spectrum and find the right balance, because even though somebody's not paying a fee, as they might in an incentive auction, to the treasury, this unlicensed use is really valuable, and how do we put a price on that? How do we talk about the value? So that's been an important part of kind of our interest in ALA and in libraries and for the values that we have. And this also played out, I think you can see this also in the E-rate proceeding, as the Wi-Fi networks were an important part of that conversation. And what does Wi-Fi mean, and what does it allow for personalized learning and collaborative learning? So I think those are some of the pieces that really matter to me in this space. And how do we find that right balance with the flexible licensed and the unlicensed going forward? And how do we identify new opportunities? What can we do together? Where can we find agreement to create more unlicensed spectrum and use it effectively?
Hi, I'm David Young with Verizon, and Verizon has a long history with Wi-Fi as well. Of course, when we deployed our FiOS, fiber to the home broadband service, a Wi-Fi router was included as part of that package from the beginning. And our customers very quickly came to depend on being able to use Wi-Fi in their homes to connect to that very fast fiber-based broadband connection. And we have continued to advance that to the latest generations of Wi-Fi technology so that the speeds that our customers can get over that Wi-Fi connection are able to keep up with the faster and faster speeds that are being delivered over the fiber. So we are excited about how Wi-Fi is being used by our customers in that wireline context in their homes. And we want to see those technology improvements continue so that the speeds that our customers can get over their wireless devices in their homes will be able to keep up with the ever faster speeds that are being delivered there. And we think that improvements in technology will allow that to occur, but we also think that additional spectrum should be made available on the unlicensed side, so that technology can continue to advance. On the mobile side, obviously, we care about licensed spectrum too, and so as Congress moves forward, looking at new spectrum opportunities, we think a balanced approach that identifies spectrum that's suitable for license use, flexible use, license use, and that can be auctioned off is obviously very, very important. And so a balanced approach that balances unlicensed with licensed is important. But our mobile customers, in addition to connecting to our networks through licensed spectrum, also use these devices to access Wi-Fi networks, as I mentioned, in their homes and when they're out and about at the library or wherever. But they also use these devices to create their own Wi-Fi hotspots. So they use the LTE network to provide the connectivity to the device, create a hotspot that then can be shared with multiple devices that they might have, or with family members or business colleagues or whatever. So we see Wi-Fi as a very integral part of the services that our customers demand from us. And like T-Mobile, we are excited about the possibilities for new technologies that can operate in the unlicensed space to give our customers even better experiences, but that will also play nicely with Wi-Fi going forward. So I think I'll stop there as far as remarks. I think we've covered a lot of the good introduction, and maybe we can turn it into a dialogue.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back a little bit and mention a piece of the history, and I thank you, Paula, for doing the 1938 number. That's interesting. It's in my book, too. It's a good number, or year. What happened in the 80s was 1985 when the FCC did the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz and 900 megahertz ISM bands, and they now getting technical, allowed higher power. So unlicensed has been allowed since 38, but at very low powers. I'm going off memory, maybe 15 milliwatts, 15 millionths of a watt, but maybe that's wrong. But something really low like that, and what they did in 85 is they said you can operate a device without a license in these three particular bands, because they were industrial bands. Microwave ovens operate the 2.4 megahertz band, which they weren't worried about unlicensed devices causing communications interference from microwaves. It's quite the opposite, the other way around. They authorized it for 1 watt, and they did it for 2 reasons. One was they weren't worried about interference to licensed services, because these were industrial bands. You can use radio frequency for more than microwave ovens. You could make paint cure, do lots of things. And secondly, a group of folks said, if you allow us to do this, we'll be able to experiment with new technologies, and we want to do something called spread spectrum technology. Don't worry about what it is. This is a new technology. It's in all the technologies that we consider current generation these days, but it was pioneered in the unlicensed. Interesting note, the Wi-Fi standard itself was first finalized by the IEEE, I believe, in 1997. Rules came out in 1985. So it took, about 12 years. In the meantime, you could do other unlicensed devices, and there are still, I believe, the last I checked, you can buy analog, baby monitors and the like in the 2.4 gigahertz band, which will interfere with Wi-Fi devices. The reason I asked that history is I found one of the most interesting things about this discussion is that oftentimes Wi-Fi is conflated with unlicensed. I mean, if you had listened to this discussion without any of my background or knowledge, hopefully my background made sense, you would think unlicensed means Wi-Fi. But I would say right now it doesn't. But it leads to an interesting question. Should it? And what does that mean? Which is why, I wanted to go through some pros and cons. So I'll pose that to the panel generally and see if anybody wants to take it. Because, one possible approach is we're not worried about all these other things. We're going to say you have to use Wi-Fi. And I don't know that anyone's proposed that. But I'll ask the question and see what people have to say. Anyone want to jump?
Sure, I'll jump in. So I think that the FCC's approach to unlicensed has been remarkably successful and has produced these terrific results. And Wi-Fi is the example that most people are most readily familiar with, although Bluetooth and Zigbee and other technologies are also commonly used. Cordless phones in your house use these spectrums. So there are other standards out there already. I think the key, though, is that keeping in place this permissionless innovation model that allows new technologies to be experimented with, brought to market, and either succeed or fail on their own merits, it has been remarkably successful and should be kept in place.
Anyone else? It's a provocative question, so you may not want to answer.
Sure, I'll go ahead as well. I mean, I do agree with David's comments. For the most part, unlicensed has meant that anyone can innovate. And so the ability to go into the band and innovate is really important. The ability for innovators to have a place that they can go and they can try out particular services or particular devices, and see what try to figure out what customers want, whether or not it works economically or it doesn't work economically, I think is really important. I think what the question begs, however, is underlying it, is I think a discussions that are happening around whether or not you can enter the band and whether or not that entrance adversely impacts the existing users of that band. I think the LTEU issue that has been referenced is where one of those discussions is occurring. And, I think from our perspective, I think you have to, if you have products in the marketplace, if you have devices in the marketplace that are leveraging these technologies that could be stranded or could be impeded or degraded, I do think you have to take a look at how you use that band. It doesn't mean that that an approach to unlicensed has to be changed permanently, but I do think coexistence and enabling all services to coexist is an important goal to try to achieve.
Yeah, I think just to comment on that, I think permissionless innovation in itself, is predicated under Part 15 of the unlicensed rules, and I think when you look at all the innovation that's happened in the unlicensed space, many of these technologies would have not come to fruition, such as Wi-Fi, had it not been for Part 15 rules. And so when you think about new technologies coming into play, fair coexistence has always been a hallmark of the unlicensed band. You have the rules that you must follow, and if the new technology follows the regulatory tenets of what's been laid out, then it should be allowed to move forward and innovate. And so I think that's kind of where we're at. We're big supporters of Wi-Fi. We have Wi-Fi integrated in the vast majority of our devices. So the notion that we would be looking at a technology that could somehow undermine the end user experience from our customer base, it just flies in the face of sound logic. I mean, our perspective, we look at this technology, we've seen the coexistence studies, it's proven that it shares well with Wi-Fi, if not better than Wi-Fi. And so I think I understand the debate, I understand the large ecosystem that's out there with Wi-Fi, but innovation should be allowed to continue. And I think that's what it's about with T-Mobile. We look at this, and this is a step. Yes, we're Wi-Fi and LTE.
Listening to both those things, it occurs to me that if you want to put this in sort of a traditional legal framework of reliance interests, there are conflicting, potentially reliance interests. I say potentially because we can argue about whether they're actually in conflict or whether they're valid. But let's assume for a second that consumers who go out and buy unlicensed devices have some sort of reliance interest in that device being able to work. Now, the legal standard is they have no reliance interest in, quote, vested interest, unquote, is what the rule says. You as a consumer, when you buy any unlicensed device, I'm not just talking about Wi-Fi, are taking your chances. Most consumers don't necessarily realize this, but there are no labeling requirements along those lines that I'm aware of. The second potential reliance interest is on an innovator, technology company, and the like who looks at the unlicensed rules, reads them, and says, the law says I can do X. Spends time and money developing a standard and advice that can do X, but then potentially interferes with existing devices that consumers have purchased. And then so the question is, wait a second, I, innovator, relied on rules that said I'm fine. Consumers now say, hey, I, royalties advisor, relying on the fact they're going to work. This is leading into a question. The way traditionally that type of thing was avoided was through those allocation and licensing rules I talked about. Unlicensed did something different. Question, there's a certain amount now, let's say, of expectation out there about unlicensed and what it means. Why I found it interesting that many people on more consumer-oriented think it means Wi-Fi. Do we give up on the traditional rules and just concede that, you know what, we should put protection in place and we're going to treat this like a traditional, more like a traditional, we're going to move up the triangle towards license? To me, that seems like a fundamental threshold question that we're dancing around, but not asking outright, so I'm going to ask it outright.
So I'm generally skeptical of either or scenarios where it's either this or it's that. It seems to me that we have some good protections in the system now that we like, that it's relatively low regulation, that it's pretty practical, that there are international technical standards, at least around the equipment. So there's some agreement that we're going to play nicely and that we all have a stake in this space. So it seems like there's a lot that we can agree on, but that doesn't mean that we might not modify or make changes. And I think that's one of the questions that I've heard in the LTEU space is, and what safeguards do we have if we take this from these tests where I think there's these questions. Does it interfere? Doesn't it? And how do we know? And then we scale to a carrier level. So it's not, kind of a small innovation. It's a big innovation. It is taking up quite a lot of space in this sector. So what happens if we go to scale, and then how do we protect that? And when do you bring in the referee of the FCC or another government body? So how do you protect what we have? And it seems to be working well. There's a lot of agreement that we've come to a good place as far as the regulation and how we all work together in this space. But also be mindful of, as new technology comes onto the scene, maybe it's a game changer. Maybe it does rock the boat and cause a new way of thinking about how do we protect the unlicensed and refine that balance. So I guess that's a question that I have being newer is, what safeguards as we take this to scale? What does that look like? And how do we make sure that we don't lose all the aspects that we've really enjoyed in this space?
I mean, I can tell you one that's been proposed, but I don't want to cut panelists. Does any panelists have a direct response? I'd rather the panelists be talking.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really a great question and a great point. The FCC clearly has a role. Today, if there are unlicensed devices, let's just say, video baby monitor, it comes in and it turns out that it's actually, causing interference somehow. The FCC has the ability to track them down and make the person stop using them. Now, if you're talking about 1 million baby monitors that have been deployed, scattered throughout the country, it's trying to find a needle in the haystack. Where is this interference coming from and how do we find it and resolve it? The type of problem that you described, Laura, is a scaling problem associated with the carrier's use. And the good news there is the carrier is not hard to find, right? And so if there is a problem, the FCC knows exactly where to go. So we don't expect that there will be a problem. Certainly a requirement for Verizon and I believe T-Mobile and everybody else who's looking into LTEU is that it does play nicely with Wi-Fi. Because our companies and our customers depend on Wi-Fi, it's critical for us that this new technology plays nicely. And so we will ensure that the technology does that, not because the FCC rules require it, they don't, but because we require it, because our customers demand it.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, much like Verizon, you talked about the MiFi product. So the mobile device, this can be turned into a Wi-Fi hotspot. So if you think about the technology as a whole and the number of Wi-Fi enabled devices that we have on our network, 35 million and growing every day. And as I said, at Un-carrier 7 last year, we said we were going to deploy Wi-Fi on every single smartphone device that we have. The way LTE works, you do have some of the signaling channels. I don't want to get too technical here, but it's to the licensed network. So you have some level of control over what that LTE small cell would be doing. So it's not like Wi-Fi per se, where you deploy a Wi-Fi unit there is no control as to what is going on with that device. It's David pointed out, it's like a needle in a haystack. If it's transmitting above its limits and it's outside of Part 15, then the commission's going to go out there and they're going to try to find that. I think in our case, it's going to be somewhat different. You do have an element of control that I think will hopefully mollify some of those concerns. But then again, when you look at the testing that has been done, there's been rigorous testing by a number of folks. The evidence is clear that interference is not an issue. It can accurately coexist. And I think the rules, I think to your point on the, should we change the rules? And, I get to the point that David made about the million baby monitors and garage door openers. And, what would they have said when Wi-Fi was coming into prominence? When all these other new technologies are coming about, are they fearful that they're going to get interfered with? I think it's a fair question, but the licensing rules or the rules per se for unlicensed were put in place to promote innovation. And I think as you pointed out, if there's no guarantee that you're not going to receive interference, but you can't cause interference. And that's part of the rules, and so LTU devices causing interference to Wi-Fi, the evidence is there, and like I said, from a business point of view, I think the carriers, first and foremost, would probably know that more than anybody else before they went down a path of trying to deploy a technology that could potentially cause harm.
Well, I promise not to make this, but I'll give you a segue, maybe. I promise not to make this an LTEU versus Wi-Fi debate, and that's certainly not the intent. So I want to try to bring it back up, and this is related to my question, but I want to talk about it a tad bit differently, which is the issue of, that Paula raised, which is a real issue of having an embedded base of devices out there on an unlicensed basis, and what happens if they do experience widespread interference is not new. And the question about what to do about it, if anything, is not new. So I just want to stress this is not an LTE Wi-Fi issue per se. One example when I was at the FCC is that garage door openers most of them operate on an unlicensed basis, not in one of these higher power bands used by Wi-Fi, but in the 300-400 megahertz range. It happens to be licensed for primarily government use. Because they're so low power, along those lines of those 15 milliwatts, the government use said, we don't mind if you do it there. Well, because the government use is the primary use under that, licensed allocation scheme, they are allowed to do what they want, and the military turned up some new radar systems that operate at relatively high power, and it turned out if you had a garage door opener at a house that was anywhere near one of these military base installations, your garage door just opened and closed randomly all throughout the day. Needless to say, as at the time, I think legal advisor to the chairman at the FCC, unfortunately wasn't wireless bureau chief yet, got an awful lot of complaints from Congress about what are you going to do about this to help these consumers. Under the rules, absolutely nothing. And we didn't do anything because there wasn't anything really that you could do legally. I mean, you could start a rulemaking and change the rules. But the point, and this is the point that I think David alluded to, is garage door openers are out there. So I wanted to make this discussion a little broader than the LTE. This is always a potential issue, and that's why I was actually being quite serious about the question: is the unlicensed experiment, if you will, at higher power really viable or not? Or what are the middle ground alternatives? I don't know what maybe Paul is going to address that.
Yeah, so I'm gonna diverge again, but I'll try to come back to your question, Fred. So
Paula, can you activate your microphone?
Sure, I'm gonna diverge, but I'm gonna try to come back. The light's on, so
it is okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Just want to go back to LTEU for a second. The LTEU protocol or technology is being developed by a small group of companies. It's not going through the regular standards body process. So we worry that there's insufficient information out there to actually figure out whether or not unlicensed devices and uses can actually coexist with LTEU. Completely appreciate the promises by my colleagues on the panel. But when you're on the other side of the issue and you have a fair amount invested in the issue, and frankly, from the numbers we see and from the economic value that it brings, I would think that it's important enough to make sure that coexistence and that all parties are comfortable with how that spectrum is shared if you're going to go into that spectrum. So I just want to just flag that because it's not unanimous that everyone believes that sharing is doable and that there's sufficient information out there to really for everyone to really get to that conclusion. So it presents a difficult question, and I think the question that Fred has posed is really that rightfully you go into the band, you use the band, and you don't, unlicensed devices are not supposed to interfere with anyone else and are supposed to be able to accept and deal with all interferences. The reality, though, is that we've had spectrum policy, and we've had an evolution of spectrum policy since 1934. And what's neat about this, and what's neat about Congress, what's neat about the FCC, is that when issues are presented, bodies have the ability to go in and figure out, is there a new path? Is there a new way to do things? What is the new paradigm? So even if today we're saying, hey, unlicensed, you are accepting all interference and you should not interfere with anyone else. If you're presented with a big problem, let's try to figure out and address that big problem. I think I like Laura's approach that this is not either or. There are creative people out there, there are thoughtful people out there. Let's figure it out.
So I think if you look at historically how this has worked, Fred alluded to it. I was watching an episode, a rerun of Seinfeld the other day, and of course they have the big cordless phone with the antenna. That was the killer app for the 2.4 gigahertz band in the late 80s and early 90s before Wi-Fi came along. And fortunately for the proponents of Wi-Fi, they didn't have to prove to the cordless phone makers that Wi-Fi wouldn't cause any harmful interference to cordless phones. If that requirement had been in place, I suspect we wouldn't have Wi-Fi today. But fortunately, the permissionless innovation model allowed Wi-Fi to develop and allowed Wi-Fi to be deployed and to develop real-world experience as to how it interacts with the incumbent users of that technology, which at the time were cordless phones. And both technologies evolve over time to interoperate with one another. And I have no reason to doubt that won't continue going forward.
And I would also add that when, I think this is probably something we can all agree on when you talk about coexistence mechanisms and what have you. A big element to this is spectrum. You get more spectrum, get more unlicensed spectrum out in the pipeline, you have more opportunity for opportunistic use of channels being available. So that is also something that we have been a big supporter of, trying to get more unlicensed spectrum out into the marketplace. And looking at existing technologies today, I mean, that's even a challenge as we're looking at 802.11ac, which is the next evolution of Wi-Fi. So when you look at some of these new technologies, spectrum can be a constraint, but if you've got abundance of spectrum, if you can fill the pipeline with more spectrum for unlicensed use, it lessens the burden for that coexistence opportunity by making the spectrum available for users when they need it.
So maybe this is less of a statement than a question. It sounds like there are other things in addition to LTU in the space that people have been paying attention to, whether it's the Wi-Fi Innovation Act or there are other areas where we could be looking at unlicensed spectrum and the opportunities that are there. So I'm curious what other things people are paying attention to, whether it's in the 5 gigahertz or the 3.5, and what else is on deck as we think about this question around LTE. And I think keep working at it, because I don't think we're done. I think there really are these questions, they're fair questions, and the standard setting piece is still important. So I think good people will continue to ask good questions in this space. But I'm wondering if there are other opportunities where there might be agreement and there might be a moment in time for us to move forward on unlicensed spectrum that we might spend a little bit of time on. And if there's something top of mind for some of you that spend a lot of time in this space.
Well, I think the 3.5 gigahertz band presents an interesting opportunity. I think it's, for folks who followed that proceeding, it's novel in the sense that it's an evolution of, I think, spectrum policy and how spectrum has been allocated. It's a 3-tiered approach whereby you have the federal incumbent. They have primacy in the band, and so users must share around them. Then you go to the next level, which would be, we call a priority access licensee. Those would be kind of, to your earlier chart up there, Fred, the pseudo licensed, if you will. And then underneath that, you have general authorized access. And there's a tremendous amount of spectrum that's being called out for unlicensed use in that proceeding, and I believe it's in the neighborhood of about 80 megahertz. So the proceeding is ongoing. There's a lot of debate on how to structure some of the licensing requirements for the PALs. Power has been a big topic of discussion, and then coexistence with some of the adjacent, the fixed satellite services, to the north of the band, or something being looked at. But I think by and large, it does present an opportunity for unlicensed spectrum. So it's important that as we move forward, that from a policy perspective, that we get the framework for that right, so that spectrum can be put to use.
Yeah, and I wanted to address that just for a sec. In some ways, that 3.5 gigahertz band to me is a combination of all three of what I would call traditional modes within one band. Yeah. Some of these, when I said the boundaries are blurry, they are being blurred. And some of my very direct questions are just trying to get the panelists to comment on what if we stop blurring and just push it all the way over. And some things I'm thinking about, this more response. The FCC has already, in my view, departed from, the Part 15, the letter of the law, if you will, Part 15 rule on interference in a number of different ways, based on some of these reliance interests, which, as I said, I do think are real. The question is, what do you do about it, and what is appropriate to do about it, or not? In the case of the browser openers, we're not doing anything about it. But so they just, in what I view as a somewhat opaque order, did a consent decree with Marriott hotels for, quote, jamming, unquote, of Wi-Fi, which, as someone purports to be an expert in this area, we can debate whether that was jamming or something else, but did not get into the details. Whatever it was, jamming or more of what you might consider a net neutrality issue, in terms of art. I think you can read the Part 15 rules to say there was no vested interest in the user of that Wi-Fi hotspot to use it or be protected from jamming if it was jamming. Now, I say you can make that argument. That's not where the consent decree ended up. So that's one example of the slippery slope, if you will, we've already started to shift. And that's why I started to ask the questions. What I don't see happening is I don't see the FCC acknowledging that it's shifting. And so, as somebody who, takes a think tank focus on policy perspective, I think it's usually better to acknowledge what it is we're talking about expressly. Do we really want to shift or not, and why? Rather than, there have been a series of decisions along those lines that have filtered out that have indicated that the FCC is interested in or willing to consider some form of protection, if you will, of unlicensed devices in some way. What we don't know, going to the, is there a middle ground, is what's the extent of those ways? What are they? When are they going to apply, and are they not going to apply? So there is going to be an ongoing debate about this, I would expect.
So I think those are really good examples. The Marriott one is interesting, and I guess there was a more recent one with the convention center. And for those who aren't familiar with it, the issue was that people wanted to create their own Wi-Fi hotspots in the hotel, and Marriott was using a system that basically prevented those from working. And what's interesting about it is the FCC didn't change Part 15 rules, right? You know, I'm sure the equipment that Marriott was using complied with the Part 15 rules completely. But what they did go after was behavior that was causing a particular effect. And so I think that gets back to Laura's question before is, you know, if there is a problem that materializes in the future somehow because of scaling or, somebody deliberately causing a problem, does the FCC have any recourse? And I think the answer is pretty clearly yes.
Well, so I kept saying I'm not going to say what some of the approaches are, but you just implied one of them. By calling it jamming, which, I can argue it wasn't, the FCC relied on a part of the statute that says you can't willfully interfere. Well, willfully is a legal standard. It pretty much means intentional. So, in other words, if you don't have a right to protection from interference when using Wi-Fi, but do you have a right from willful? So is it okay to protect it if it's willful? And then, of course, we've got to talk about what willful means. That's one potential middle ground. We don't want folks out there turning up systems that comply with the technical rules but cause interference and knowingly doing it because they want to cause interference for whatever reason. I mean, Marriott had economic reasons. That's one potential thing to think about. I mean, the FCC already arguably set precedent that leans in that direction. Anyone else? We can open, I think we're till 1:15. We're going to open up for questions, but I want to make sure everybody had a chance to say what they wanted to say. Did anyone from the audience have any questions for the panelists? Yes. Ben, do we have a mic that they... No. So speak loudly.
Did you have a loud voice?
That is not a problem. Hi, Rick Sermon from NTTA. So I wanted to get a little more on your point, Brad, about reliance interests. And I've used the term myself in some settings, and I'm not sure I like the term because you said there's no legal requirement, but to distinguish a little bit from garage door openers or the Seinfeld cordless phone, because the recent Cisco stats, I think, on wireless devices show that the average household today has 11 Wi-Fi devices in the home. I did a count. I have 3 kids, the oldest of which is 10. We have 22 Wi-Fi enabled devices in our home. By 2017, Cisco estimates 86% of all in-home usage will be Wi-Fi. So the point I'm trying to make is, versus the garage door opener situation, those reliance interests are going to be quite tremendous. So I take T-Mobile and Verizon at their word that they don't intend to interfere, but I must take issue with John Hunter when he says that it's proven, the tests all show. Cable Labs, the research arm of the cable industry, did just post a blog the other day expressing concern. Part of it, and this goes to the question that you raised, and you offered up a reliance interest that says, well, the rules are one way around these issues, but there's another way too, and that's the standard setting bodies. And we haven't talked about the standard setting bodies. And I think one of our concerns is that the LTU forum, which is a carrier-led group, seems to be a very closed and narrow forum, and our folks have, I think, wanted to work with the LTU forum and suggest that they work with IEEE and work with the 3GPP, which has an international standard, et cetera. So I guess to boil down the, as Phil Weiser likes to call it, the confession, for anyone that knows Yiddish here, maybe no one in the audience, nothing. Okay. So the question is really on standard setting bodies and what is the appropriate role and whether, in fact, the standard setting bodies can get together and try to work this out in advance.
Well, you were mentioned by name, John. So
Can you believe that? Mentioned by name. Well, first off, T-Mobile is not a member of the LTU forum. So we've looked at this independently. We've assessed it across the board, and I think we had some discussion about this forum setting and why specifications were being developed there versus, say, 3GPP, a standards body setting. And a lot of debate was, LBT, listen before talk, versus the CSAT algorithm that's being used in LTU. When you look at what's required for LBT that's not a U.S. mandate. That's something to be satisfied in Europe. So that requirement does not exist in the United States from an incumbent federal system perspective. So the LTU forum put together these specifications. And again, this is an evolution, just like any technology that's deployed. It evolves along the way. This would be the first generation of deploying and innovating in this space. And when you show, and I know you mentioned Cable Labs with their study, but we've got our studies too. And so we can get in this debate, your study, my study. The fact of the matter is when you look at also the number of devices you're talking about that would reside in one's home with Wi-Fi, I would bet to guess that about half of those are wireless phones. Because we have Wi-Fi, this will become a Wi-Fi hotspot. It uses Wi-Fi. And the idea that it would also use LTU. So how do you reconcile that conflict? If there's the potential for interference in deploying that, it's hard to understand how one would deploy something in a manner that would be so intrusive in the same device. So I hear your point. We've heard it from the other side. I think a lot of this boils down to a business issue, not a technical issue. I think you'll find that on both sides. I know Cable in general have deployed hundreds, if not thousands, of Wi-Fi hotspots across the country. So but you know what? We have too, and we have Wi-Fi hotspots, but we also have a licensed macro network. And so we believe they can coexist, and the evidence will show that.
And just to build on that, the beauty of the band that we're talking about, and it's a 5 gigahertz band, coupled with the low power requirements for unlicensed, means that it doesn't go that far. It doesn't go through walls that well.
Right.
And so the Wi-Fi in Rick's home is safe because his Wi-Fi hotspot that's using the 5 gigahertz band is propagating that throughout his home. But another technology that's being used outside his home at low power, as required by the unlicensed rules, will not be propagating into his home and causing interference. So part of the beauty of the way the unlicensed rules have worked is that there's sort of a natural protection from interference that's created by the power requirements, coupled with the higher frequency band that we're talking about here, really makes interference highly unlikely.
So I go back to just the notion that, let's share the information. Let's figure it out. I think John referenced the LAA's approach, where there's a different rule overseas in Europe than there is here. And some folks anticipate that might get to a better place in terms of sharing. There different ways to approach this. Let's figure out what the right way is, and let's all come together and figure that out.
Yeah, since we're getting close on time, I think that I'm really glad that the Internet Caucus had this forum. I hope there's going to be more of them. The reason why ALA and Michael's out of this space is that everybody has to care about this space. This spectrum is critically important. It always has been, but it's going to be even more so, and there's not enough of it. So we better learn how to share it and to make the best use of it. So I hope that all the congressional staff folk in this room is on their own learning curve will continue to look across this and to remember as well that this is a public interest. It's a library issue. It's a school issue. It's a people issue. It's not just a business issue or a commercial issue, which is not to say that my colleagues don't care about people, but just that, that these issues, that these issues, I think, often get framed through strictly commercial lenses. And I think that we need to do more to look at what this looks like as far as public interest and public institutions. What does that look like in the space? And then also, what does it mean as far as equity of access and digital inclusion? Because I think, and that's one of the things that's on people's papers here, is that a lot of the folks that we are looking at for low-income people, for people of color, that they very much depend on library service as a complement, particularly as they're building their own wealth and ability to engage in the digital economy. So all of those factors sometimes don't make the front page, and I think they're going to be really important, and that's part of the reason why I'm really glad to be here and to be learning in this space. And I think there's a lot more talking and listening and learning that needs to happen.
So I'm going to, if you don't mind.
We have a couple minutes.
Sounds good. So I'm just going to jump in and just toss out a couple more stats. When you think of the future and you think of unlicensed, and this is not just Wi-Fi, think of also device-to-device communications. So this is you know, when you hear us talk, we tend to talk about sometimes our specific interests. But as Laura is saying, this is much broader. In 2019, the network devices in the U.S., machine-to-machine devices that are connected will be 58% of the network devices that exist. Compare that to smartphones, which will only be 8% of the network devices in 2019, or projected to be 8% of the network devices in 2019. Part of what I'm getting at here is that this issue is a big issue, and it includes industries, and it includes innovators that are not here. I mean, this is tremendous value with respect to our economy. These are big, meaty issues. Also, I talked about sort of the internet traffic and the what's literally carrying our internet traffic, and I tossed out initially the number of 66% being carried by fixed or Wi-Fi networks. Compare that to only 11% being carried by mobile networks. Going back to the notion that when you talk about wireless broadband connectivity, Wi-Fi, fixed networks are like the backbone, or it's the workhorse of how we connect. And so it makes it really important. And it highlights Fred's question, do we need to protect it separately or not? But I think at a minimum, we've got to resolve the issues that surround it, and and resolve, issues that where folks are talking about potential degradation to potential degradation to those services.
Well, I think we're just about out of time, but as the moderator has the prerogative to have the last word, so I want to thank the caucus. It's been great, and I hope panelists did a great job. The issues are difficult. I think they cut across consumers and companies whose interests may or may not always be consistent in this space or any other. So it's complicated. Thanks for staying with us.
Thank you.